Okay, so last time we did the bulk of our work on the skeletal system. So let's review just for a few minutes. If you could divide the human skeleton, how many bones do we have? Probably 206. If you could divide those 206 bones into two categories, what would those two categories be called? Axial and appendicular. So let's do the easy one first. Axial skeleton. What's our axis that we're talking about? Up and down, straight up and down. So what are the bones of our axial skeleton? Sternum, skull, two S's, spine or vertebrae, and the ribs. That's it. That's our axial skeleton. Head, vertebrae, and the ribs and the sternum that holds the ribs together. What makes up the appendicular skeleton? Everything else. Your pectoral girdle, pelvic girdle, arms, and legs. So those are the divisions of our skeleton. Now, if we look at the bones just by themselves, independent of anything else, what's one of the functions that you can ascribe to bones? We had a list. I'm not going to repeat them all, but what are some of the functions of bones, just the bones themselves? Support. We certainly couldn't stand up without our bones. What else do the bones do, especially this thing right here? Protects. Protection of the brain. Our ribs protect our lungs and heart. What do we store in bones? Metal and fats. Minerals and fats. Okay, definitely minerals. But we do have one very important molecule that is essential. Say it louder. Calcium. Remember, we talked about calcium. Bone is calcium phosphate. Now, if we consider bones along with this next tissue that we're going to talk about, what can we do now? Move. We can move things, we can accomplish work. Your heart can beat. Your stomach can process food. All of this is because of this next tissue type that we refer to as muscular tissue. Now, our skeleton and bone. We said bone was what kind of our four categories of tissue? What does bone represent? You remember our four tissue types? Epithelium. What does epithelium do? Covers. Is bone epithelium? No. It's our second tissue type. Muscle. What does muscle to do? Contract. Do bones contract? No, they break instead of contract. Third tissue type. One more before that one. There's one more before that one. Starts with an N. Nervous. Nervous. What's our C word for nervous? Conducts. Transmits the signal, sends it, conducts. Now we get to the fourth, which is our miscellaneous category, right? Connective tissue. Connective tissue. What's our C word for connective tissue? Completes. If it's not in one of the other three, where does it have to go? Connective tissue. So now we start into our muscle tissue, one of our major types. And it probably isn't surprising that muscle comprises almost half of the mass of your body. Half of your weight comes from muscle. Now, here's the good thing if you are trying to lose mass. And I like to say mass instead of weight. Because one of the worst things you can do if you're trying to be more healthy is to step on a scale. You need to stay off of the scale. Because as you eat better, more nutritious foods, as you begin to burn more calories than you consume, you will be shifting your mass from fat to what? Muscle. Which weighs more for 1 unit of space, muscle or fat? Muscle. What you need to pay attention to instead of the number on the scale is how your clothes fit. That's going to be the telltale sign that you are changing the shape of your body by adding muscle in the place of fat. Now, we've talked about the fact that guys are inherently lazy, right? Work smarter, not harder. That's another word for lazy. I like the fact that the more muscle you have in your body, the more energy and calories you burn doing nothing. Oh, that's a sweet deal. So when I'm sitting and watching baseball on television, if I have more muscle, I'm burning more calories. And if any of my kids say, why don't you get up and do something? I go, I'm burning calories. Shut up. So muscle, we want muscle. Lean muscle mass is what everybody goes for, to be healthier. And you trade that muscle for fat. Now, I think we're good muscles movement, right? Move stuff, pick up stuff, walk, run, jump. But did you realize that muscles and certain muscles also resist movement? Did you ever think of it that way? If it was not for your postural muscles, sitting in the chair or walking, standing upright, your muscles are resisting against gravity to keep your body from slumping over. How many of you had a mother like me? Growing up, keep your shoulders back. My mother was always, keep your shoulders. You've got to have a certain muscle tone to keep your shoulders back. It's too easy just to slouch and slunch around, right? Keeping your shoulders back. Those are the muscles that resist gravity and resist movement to help you maintain proper posture. Now, here's one that you also may not relate to. Muscles generate heat. Did you ever think about muscles generating heat? Well, first of all, when muscles move, they are going to use energy. And then the process of using that energy, liberating that energy from the bonds of a molecule we're going to call ATP, there is going to be some heat that is released. But I want you to go ahead and get this visual. We're going to go into the details later in the class. Muscles do one thing and only one thing. What's our C word? Contract. Muscles shorten. And the way muscles shorten is we have two proteins. We're going to say this is protein M and this is protein A. I said we were going to start simple and get more complex. So protein M and protein A. These proteins make up your muscle cells. Your muscle cells are loaded with these M and A proteins, and they overlap just a little bit when the muscle's resting. So guess what happens when your muscle and your muscle cells have to shorten? What happens to M and what happens to A? They slide across each other. You see how I'm moving my fingers closer to my knuckles? They're sliding across each other, and what's happening to the distance between my two wrists? It's shortening. That's how muscles work. That's how muscles contract, and we're going to get into more detail of that as we go. So have you ever experienced your muscles generating heat before? Let me put it to you like this. When it was, 12 degrees back in December? Did anybody venture outside in 12 degrees and maybe you didn't have a big enough coat on? What does your body start to do when you get cold? Start to shiver. What is that? What's causing you to shiver? Your muscles. Your muscles are contracting involuntarily, and those proteins M and A are sliding back across each other really fast, right? Why? Okay, let's do this experiment. Put your pens down, phones down, watches down, whatever you got in your hand, put them down. Hands up. Your left hand is protein M. Your right hand is protein A. Put them together. Now let's shiver. What are you generating? Heat. Those two little microscopic proteins that make up your muscles sliding back, it's like rubbing two sticks together to start a campfire. That's how your body is trying to warm itself. So muscles move things, they resist movement, and your muscles, when you're outside and you're cold, can generate heat in much that same way. So your body temperature is maintained Your brain has a huge control system and receptors that are sending back information about your body temperature. And your muscles are going to account for 75% of all the heat that's within your body. That's a huge percentage. It's extremely important. We cannot forget that our muscles actually help us maintain our body temperature. And when it gets too low, they're going to work extra hard and shivering, burn that extra energy to keep our body temperature within a normal range. So we've already said muscle cells contract. That's what they do. That's what they actively do. But when you tell a muscle cell to be passive, what is that muscle cell then going to do? Relax. It's almost like an elastic band. The muscle cells contract, but then after they are told to stop contracting, passively and automatically they relax and extend themselves. So we use energy for this one, but this is a rebound. This is a passive event. We don't have to have energy to relax. But we do have to have a signal to contract. And that signal to contract means that muscle cells are excitable. You can signal them to contract. And that signal is either going to be chemical or the signal is going to be electrical. And when we look at this process, the nervous system typically is going to send those chemical signals that the muscle cell will interpret, convert into an electrical signal. And that electrical signal is going to be passed from cell to cell to cell within that muscle to cause the whole muscle to contract. So it's kind of like we're doing both at the same time, using both a chemical and electrical signal to cause a muscle contraction. So we have three specific types of muscle. Since we just left the skeletal system, we're going to start first with skeletal muscle. Meaning, these are the muscles that are attached to your bones. These are the engines that are going to drive the levers, the bones, to accomplish a great amount of work. So when we first look at skeletal muscle, I want you to understand skeletal muscle is voluntary. And before, we touched on the fact that we do have some skeletal muscle that is under subconscious control. Remember, we talked about the diaphragm. We talked about linking. But it's still voluntary. We can still control them. And that is a very important characteristic of our skeletal muscle. We have 206 bones, but man, we're starting to pile up the numbers here. We have over 600 distinct muscles present in the human body. And many of these muscles are arranged in such a way that they are in groups or they occur in pairs. Some of these are going to work in concert to accomplish a movement, but some of these muscles are going to almost appear to work against one another. They're called antagonistic groups, and we'll see how they function and the purpose of having those muscles actually right here. So, synergistic, muscles working to produce the same movement. Your quadriceps in your leg, your quadriceps muscles are going to be functioning to straighten your leg, to help you stand up. Why do you think that quadriceps is called quadriceps? There's 4 muscles in that group working together. This muscle in your forearm that functions to flex your forearm, it's in your upper arm, functions to flex your forearm. It's called the biceps. Why is it called the bi? 2, working the same. Now I'm going to flip a switch and talk about antagonistic muscle groups that work opposite of each other. We talked about the biceps to flex your forearm. Where's the triceps muscle? These are some that you're possibly more familiar with. Biceps is on top, your triceps is on the back of your upper arm. And when that muscle contracts, it causes your forearm to extend. Do You see how the biceps trying to do this and the triceps, they're working against each other? Why would you want muscles working against each other? Can you think of an advantage for working against each other? If you have the biceps contracting to a certain degree and the triceps contracting to a certain degree, you can get very tight, precise control of where you position your forearm in space, and you can make those changes very rapidly. Much more so than you could do with just one muscle contracting and relaxing. Now you're contracting this way and you're contracting the other way for more rapid and more precise control. And we're going to have a number of these antagonistic groups if you look throughout the body. So here's our example of the biceps. This is going to be your upper arm. And remember, what is our bone of our upper arm? Humerus. So if you look on the top, this is our biceps, comprised of 2 components, and our triceps comprised of 3 on the back of the arm. And you can see because of their attachment, this on the front of the forearm, this is on the back. When this muscle contracts, the arm moves this way. When this muscle contracts, it's going to pull on the back and it's going to cause the forearm to try to straighten out. This is called an extension of the forearm. So just a pictorial example of that antagonistic group of muscles. You see the red coloration? That's actually our muscle cells, the muscle tissue itself. But notice as we get closer to the bone, what color do we have? This is white tissue. You no longer have muscle cells, but you have this dense, fibrous connective tissue that's mostly collagen. And it is what is attached to the bone. That is the tendon. Now we're going to look at these tendons a little bit closer, but I want you to understand this tendon, this very tough tissue that's attached to our periosteum of our bone, and those fibers are just woven together. So you're not likely going to detach those tendons from the bones. But understand that collagen material is almost like a sleeve of collagen that's attached to the one bone and attached to the other bone, and the muscle is within that collagen sleeve. Because you wouldn't want to try to attach that collagen to the muscle at the very end, because anytime you have that sort of connection, that sort of joint, it's a weak spot. And so the tendon is going to course, this collagen courses throughout the muscle, and that gives it so much more strength than if we just tried to attach it to the bone and to the very end of that muscle. So speaking of the different ends of how our muscles are attached, we have what is referred to as the origin of a muscle and the insertion of the muscle. And again, we're going to go back to our illustration of our biceps. So if we look at the biceps, we're going to see that the origin, the point of attachment for the muscle that is relatively more stationary. It doesn't mean it's not going to move at all, but relative to the other end, which one is more stationary? That's the origin. And for our biceps, that's going to be our scapula. What's the common name for scapula? Shoulder blade. Now when we look at the other end of our biceps, it is going to be attached to the radius. Where do you find the radius? What part of your arm? Upper or lower? Your lower part, that's your forearm. So the more movable point is called the insertion. So when your muscle contracts, it's going to pull on these 2 points. One of these points is going to move, one is not going to move much at all. And when you think of your shoulder blade, it's really not going to go anywhere. But your forearm is going to move upward. It is going to flex. And that flexion is referred to as the action of a specific muscle or a specific group of muscles. So the action of your biceps is to flex the forearm. Our antagonistic muscle of the bicep is what? Tricep. And when it contracts, what is your forearm going to do? Extend. That is the action. Because of how the muscle is situated and what its origin and insertion is, that's what dictates what the action of that particular muscle and that particular skeletal feature is going to be. So again, here's our illustration of bicep and tricep. When we contract the biceps and we relax the triceps, contract the bicep, we're pulling on the radius, the forearm moves up. That action is flexion. Now we have to relax the bicep, contract the tricep, pull on this point of the insertion on the ulna, and that's going to cause the forearm to extend or straighten itself out. But what are these two muscles doing? What are the biceps doing? What are the triceps doing? Simply contracting. Those origins and assertions and their attachments, that's what leads to the specific action of the muscle. So now let's look at the organization of muscle. We're doing a little bit of anatomy. Haven't got to the histology part where we're looking at the cells yet. But when we talk about a muscle, we can describe that muscle as the whole muscle, the biceps. That is the whole muscle. But we can take that whole muscle and we can break it down into several smaller units that we call fascicles. Now remember I told you that collagen material that the tendons are made out of? I wanted you to think of it like a tube that goes from the origin to the insertion. Well, there are actually several tubes. Here you can see the tendon material attached to the bone. All that white is collagen. Some of that material comes up and makes a tube that wraps the entire muscle. But we have other tubes of collagen going from origin to insertion that form the muscle cells into these little bundles called fascicles. You see that white material around each one of those? They draw that white because it's the same collagen that we see is making up our tendons. So connective tissue all the way around the outside. Now we have connective tissue wrapping up each one of our fascicles. We even have connective tissue wrapping around each individual muscle cell. So the point being, all this really strong collagen going from origin to insertion with all these different units makes for a very strong attachment point. And if you are going to tear a tendon, you are typically going to tear that tendon away from the bone. You're not going to rip it through the muscle. Have you ever seen any of these bodybuilders and weightlifters that tear their bicep? NFL players do that. If they tear down here at the radius, the bicep rolls up like a blind and you have a knot way up here. That's more common. Tearing at the scapula is not as common, but then it would roll down toward the elbow. Just a knot. Yeah, it's almost sickening at the stomach to look at. But that's that strong connection of all that connective tissue running all the way through that muscle. So you saw the fascicles. We had one individual muscle cell that was raised up above the fascicles so you can see that arrangement of these muscles. And so that collagen tissue that wraps the muscle cells, that wraps the fascicles, that wraps the whole muscle, that simply extends beyond the end of our bicep as tendon material. Nothing but collagen. And do you remember when we talked about collagen? Collagen is going to resist what? Remember what we said collagen resisted? Or what is collagen really not going to do? You're not going to stretch it. It's really there for strength and support. It's not elastic and it's not stretchable. So we're going to have a very, very tight adhesion of our entire muscle. Now, we've talked about the whole muscle. We've talked about the individual muscle cells being bundled into these packages called fascicles. Well, as we're getting smaller and smaller here, when we get down to the individual muscle cells, understand we can call those muscle cells muscle fibers. I tend not to do that. I'm pointing that out to you because that's what your textbooks are going to say. You can hear people talk about muscle fibers. I don't typically like to use that word, fibers, because we have another word that we're going to use for those proteins, M and A, that we introduced earlier. They're arranged in these protein filaments called myofibrils. Myo is a prefix that means muscle, so that literally is muscle fibrils. I don't want you to confuse that with muscle fibers. So we're just going to stick with muscle cells. And inside these individual muscle cells, we have these long cables of these proteins, M and A, that are going to be responsible for contracting. Now we're going to put some other letters with our M and A. What is our M going to be? Myosin, and A, actin. Those are our two contractile proteins in every muscle in your body. Highlight that, write that down. Whether we're talking about skeletal muscle or the other two types, you have to have actin and myosin if you're going to contract. If you don't have actin and myosin, you're not going to contract. Now, to give you a little perspective, this looks similar to that muscle fascicle we saw in the previous slide, but I want you to understand that what's being folded back here is not the connective tissue. This is one muscle cell. One skeletal muscle cell in the plasma membrane is folded back. And these cables that you see filling inside of that muscle cell are the repeating arrangement of our myosin and actin proteins into these cables that we call the myofibril. Does everyone see that? That arrangement is critical. Now, you notice we have some areas that are red and some areas that are kind of white with that black line right through the middle of them. The overlapping nature of our actin and myosin and how they're so aligned inside the muscle cell is going to give that muscle cell a striped pattern. You see the red and white stripes here? When you look on the outside of all of your skeletal muscle cells, you are going to see a striped pattern. And so with skeletal muscle, we said it's voluntary. But another characteristic of our muscle cells is they are striated. You ever heard that term before? Maybe in biology in high school. Skeletal muscle is striated, which is a big fancy word for what? Striped. It's striped muscle. And that pattern is due to the arrangement of our actin and our myosin, our contractile proteins, that are arranged like I did my fingers earlier. All right, so we've got what the whole muscle looks like, all the way down to our cells, and that arrangement of actin and myosin and our myofibrils. That arrangement's critical for what we're going to start talking about now. And that is, how do we actually shorten the muscle? How does it work biochemically? And don't let that biochemical word scare you. But if we're looking at a contraction, our skeletal muscles must be activated by a nerve. That's one characteristic of our voluntary muscles that is going to make it different from what we see with our cardiac muscles. When we talk about cardiac muscle, we talk about the heart. Did you know your heart's going to beat even if you had no nerves going to it at all? Your heart's going to beat. Your heart's going to keep that rhythm just like a metronome if you had band or piano. The nerves going to your heart make your heart either beat faster or beat slower. But your heart beats on its own. Skeletal muscle can't do that. They have to have a nerve that tells it when to contract. Now, when the nerve signals chemically that muscle cell to contract, I want you to realize two things here. Calcium is required for the nerve signaling. But then once the nerve signals the muscle cell, calcium gets released in the cytoplasm of the muscle cell to cause the muscle cell to contract. So calcium's needed twice, for the nerve to signal and for the muscle to contract. If you don't have calcium, you're not going to get the signal. And if you don't have calcium in the muscle, muscle's not going to contract. So see why bones storing calcium and being able to release it into the blood or store it in the blood when you have excess, calcium is critical for your body. So when calcium is signaled and it floods in and around those myofibrils, you get a contraction. When the nerve stops signaling the muscle, your muscle cells turn on a calcium vacuum, and the calcium gets sucked out of the cytoplasm and it's stored in its own organelle. And since calcium is removed from those myofibrils, the myofibrils relax and they spread out. So calcium leads to contraction. The removal of calcium leads to relaxation. And what causes that to happen? When the nerve stops signaling. As long as you're getting the signal, calcium's going to stay around your myofibrils. Your muscles are going to continue to contract. The nerve stops, calcium vacuums come on, calcium's removed, and your muscles relax. Once again, if nothing else, hopefully you leave the class realizing calcium is very, very important for your overall health. Yes and no. There's one example. The question was, is that kind of related to your muscles being paralyzed? This is more related to the muscles being able to detect that signal from the nerves. Have you ever heard of a chemical called curare? This is a chemical that some of these Aboriginal tribes, they will produce and dip their blow darts in. And then they go hunting for like monkeys in the trees. And they will shoot that blow dart that's got the curare on the end of it. And when the curare gets inside the primate, the monkey, it blocks the receptors for the chemicals from the nerves to the skeletal muscles. And so the nerves can't signal the muscle to contract. And so all the muscles in the monkey's body do? They all relax. What does the monkey do? Falls out of the tree. What do? Go catch the monkey. So it's just downstream from the calcium, but if you could block the calcium channels, it would do the same thing. I just don't know of a chemical, I'm sure there probably is one, I just don't know of one that works specifically that way. But curare works in a similar way, just blocking the receptors for the chemicals. So since your muscles move, a lot like motors make things move, the nerves that cause your muscle cells to contract are called motor neurons. Many times they call them alpha motor neurons because there's different categories, alpha just simply being the first. And the nerve is going to attach itself to the plasma membrane of the muscle cell in what is called a neuro, for nerve, muscular, because we're on a muscle, junction. Some also refer to this as a motor end plate. It's the point where that nerve is going to start the signaling to the muscle. The chemicals will be detected from that nerve and then converted into an electrical signal that spreads throughout the muscle cell, leading to contraction of the entire muscle. So when the nerve excites the skeletal muscle cell, we have an organelle inside of our muscle cells that is similar to our ER. And what is our ER? What does that stand for? Endoplasmic reticulum. Now, if we put an R in front of our endoplasmic reticulum, what's going to be the function of that thing, the RER? Do you remember the function of that? Why does it get rough? Ribosomes, and what do we know ribosomes are the location for? Making protein. So the rough endoplasmic reticulum is primarily making protein. In your muscle cells, the endoplasmic reticulum, some of them, they don't make protein. They're specialized in storing, releasing, and vacuuming calcium back into itself. And that specialized organelle is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarco as a prefix means muscle, but more on a cellular level, whereas myo talks about more on a tissue level. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum stores calcium. It controls its release when stimulated by a nerve. And when the nerve stops signaling, you have other transporters in the membrane of the sarcoplasmic reticulum that are calcium vacuums that suck the calcium back inside of it to get it away from our myofibrils, that then leads to the relaxation of our muscle. So in our illustration, we have a nerve coming down from the top. We can see the end of our neuron where we're going to release these chemicals that are going to be signalers. They are detected by the muscle membrane, and these yellow squiggly lightning bolts are the electrical signal that spreads all throughout our muscle cell. Here you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 myofibrils. The big red dots are our myosin. The little black dots are our actin that make up the myofibrils. You see how they're arranged. And this blue network of stuff that's all throughout and all around our myofibrils, that is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And you can even see in this illustration as our lightning bolt is coming down and stimulating the sarcoplasmic reticulum, these little white balls are released. They're trying to illustrate the release of calcium. So this illustration is showing the initiation of a muscle contraction and how it would begin. All right, so we've already talked about generating heat, right? Actin and myosin sliding back and forth across each other. That is the form, the sliding filament, that's going to be initiated by the release and the binding of calcium. Now I want you to understand how the filaments slide. So when you look at my fingers, if you do your fingers in front of you like this, myosin and actin, how they're sliding back across each other. Understand when the muscle is at rest, there's no contact between actin and myosin. They're not touching each other. But you have these little, they look like Q-tip heads on your myosin, which is a much thicker filament. You might have 300 of these Q-tip heads. They're like little hands. These little hands of our myosin filament are going to be where you can generate and liberate the energy from ATP. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Because we have to have energy to contract. So when we think about our myosin molecule, I want you to think of it like this. If you were to extend your arms, you're a myosin molecule. This is the very middle of that myofibril, my body. I've got my two hands. These are like our two little Q-tips. You're going to generate and liberate energy from ATP in each one of my hands. That's going to cause my hands to grab on to actin. When I grab actin, the rest of this myosin molecule that are my arms, they're going to pull toward the middle. And since I've had hold of actin, what's that going to do to actin? It's going to pull those actin filaments closer to the middle. And when you have all these actin and myosin lined up in series in this myofibril, that's going to cause the ends of the muscle to come closer together. That's going to cause the muscle itself to shorten. So the myosin molecule is the pulling molecule. The actin molecule, that's going to be the slide that is being moved closer to the middle of our myofilament. Now, here's an example of our myosin. Do you see in this illustration these little Q-tip heads, almost like little teardrops? This is when the muscle is relaxed. There we can see our myosin. Here are our little twisted beads. That's going to be our actin. It's a much thinner fiber. When we're at rest, there's no contact. But when a nerve signals, calcium is released from, what was that organelle we release it from? What reticulum? Sarcoplasmic. Calcium then is going to cause these little Q-tip heads of myosin to contact the actin and grab them. And because you've already got energy stored in that little Q-tip head, when it grabs actin, it's going to bend. And as it bends, it's pulling the actin closer to the middle of that myosin molecule. So this end of the actin on the right and this end of actin on the left are going to be pulled closer together, and that little unit of our myofibril shortens. And when we have each one of these units shortened microscopically, the whole muscle can shorten by centimeters. So we have to really get down to the molecular level to understand how a big muscle like the quadriceps actually is contracting. So this is another illustration showing myosin on the bottom. Actin are the little gray beads that you see here on the top. Now this is a freebie. We're not going to get into this kind of detail here. But you have other molecules that are exemplified by the green lifesavers. I almost said lightsaber. Too much of a Star Wars. And this little green thread that's called tropomyosin. When the muscle is relaxed, that little green thread is blocking all those little, I call them olive pits in this picture. Do you see the little dark holes? Those little dark holes are where the hands of myosin can grab. But at rest, that little thread, the tropomyosin, is in the way. It blocks myosin binding to actin. But when calcium is present, calcium sits in that little lifesaver called troponin. And when calcium binds to troponin, it causes that little green thread to slide out of the way, which then allows the Q-tip to bind to actin and leads to the sliding. And do you see now when you remove calcium, that thread goes back into place? Myosin can't contact actin, and it has to relax. So that's the molecular action of calcium that leads to calcium present. You can get a connection, a cross bridge, as it's called, between myosin and actin. When calcium is absent, those binding sites are blocked, and you can't get a cross bridge, therefore you have to relax. So there's that cross bridge that forms between actin and myosin. And down at the bottom is a little animated GIF that is going to show how these three contractile units, each one shortening microscopically, you can see we're pulling on the right and pulling on the left and how we're shortening that whole unit. You see that? Now, each one of these units that are composed of your myosin and these two overlapping actins, that contractile unit is called a sarcomere, a muscle segment. And that's a portion of our myofibril, and when you have these in the hundreds and thousands along the length of your muscle, that's how your muscle can shorten. But none of that is going to happen without energy. You're not going to form a cross bridge without energy. You're not going to have repeated cycles of contraction without energy. Muscles are simply not going to work without a source of energy. Now, here again is an example of our sarcomere in the middle. We actually have 1, 2, 3 sarcomeres on top. And here we have our myosin with all the little Q-tip heads and our 2 parts of actin on either side. That defines one sarcomere, which is the functional contractile unit of our myofibril. Now, we said muscles have to have energy to contract, right? The energy currency in your body, what all of your cells need to survive, to contract, for you to think, that energy currency is called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. I want you to think of adenosine like a square box that's got these 3 little circles attached to it. Each one of those circles is a phosphate. The energy that your cells need, the energy your muscles need to contract, is stored between the bond of the 3rd and the 2nd phosphate in the chain. To liberate that energy, you have to clip that bond, let that 3rd phosphate go, and recover the energy that was in that chemical bond to accomplish work. Now, where does ATP come from? Mitochondria. What kind of house did we say that was? The powerhouse of the cell. So the mitochondria produces the ATP that your cells need. ATP is absolutely required for a muscle contraction. That little Q-tip head of myosin, each one of those has to have a molecule of ATP to form that cross bridge to grab actin in the first place. But then it also needs it to bend and pull the actin and slide it across itself. But here's the crazy thing. You have to have a second ATP molecule for the Q-tip to release and reset so it can grab actin again. Because one move of that myosin molecule, it's not going to be enough to fully contract the muscle. They're like pistons of the car. To fully contract a muscle, these Q-tips are going to be contracting, letting go, contracting, letting go. And to get these repeated cycles for each one, you've got to have 2 molecules of ATP per cycle. And depending on how much work you're trying to accomplish, that can be a significant amount of energy that's consumed by your muscle. So if you're running a race, you've been watching the Olympics, right? So they're on. I watched some of it. So you've got some of these speed skating events, right? Where they'll make 1 or 2 laps. But then you've got these other events where they will go like 10 laps. You think, okay, well, you got to have a lot more energy to go 10 laps than you have to go to do 1 or 2. No, not necessarily. Because a sprinter is going to burn a ton of energy a lot faster. A marathon runner is going to burn energy not as rapidly, but they're going to require energy during the whole time. So when we look at our ATP, where does it come from? And how do we use it so that we can accomplish the stringency of the work, or we can have the stamina to do the work as long as we need to? And so your body is set up so that if you're going to sprint, you've got enough ATP stored in your muscle cells that it might last you about 10 seconds worth. And then you're out of gas. But the good thing is, while you're burning that ATP, you also begin to use ATP that's sort of stored in reserve. But you're only going to have about 30 seconds to use that. And most of those races I saw last a whole lot longer than 30 seconds. So then, after 30 seconds, what do we do? Just quit? If you're lazy like me, probably. I don't like to exercise long. But past about 30 seconds, then we start recovering energy from glycogen. Glycogen, remember, is that storage form of glucose in human bodies and in animals. And we're going to take glycogen and we're going to begin to break down glycogen to produce more ATP. And we've got enough glycogen stored nearby that we can last about 3 to 5 minutes using our glycogen stores. And then finally, for extended periods of time, we're going to start making brand new ATP from the mitochondria in a process that is called aerobic respiration. Aerobic means we're going to use oxygen to make energy. So this means that you're not going to run at the same pace for 1,500 meters that you would for 100 meters. You got to pace yourself. And if you are consuming more ATP than you can produce and subscribe oxygen for, then you're going to go into a period that's called anaerobic respiration. You're not going to produce nearly as much energy, and you're not going to be able to last long doing that. So when you put this out graphically, here's time in seconds. So there's our ATP stored in the muscle. You can see, poof, it's gone pretty quickly. Here, this dashed line is how we start consuming that intermediate of ATP. And after about 10 seconds, then we start to deplete it. Then we have glycogen that's going to go for a while, but it starts running out. And then here, slowly getting ramped up, is our mitochondria, but you see how it plateaus out as well. That plateau for our mitochondria is largely dependent on our supply of oxygen. So that's why, if you can think about jogging, you can probably jog further than you could if you were trying to run that same distance. Because when you're exerting yourself at a higher level, I mean, you're just going to tank out. You're going to hit that wall and you're going to stop. Because you're burning all of your energy, and you're probably going to be breathing harder because you're trying to get more oxygen into your body to make this energy so your muscles can keep going. But if you're just jogging such a way that you're getting enough oxygen to supply ATP to your muscles, theoretically, you could run forever. As long as you were continuing to get some carbohydrates, as long as you're continuing to eat something. You watch these marathon runners, they're always grabbing water and then snack bars, but mostly just sugar to give their bodies ATP. And you know, one way that this bears out in our past, when you look at early humans, they were hunter-gatherers. How did early humans hunt and capture their food? How did they hunt and capture their food? Some of them had primitive weapons like spears, right? But you got to get pretty close to the animal to kill it, right? Studies are really showing now, based on what we know about muscles and what we know about physiology, early humans ran their food to death. Ran their food to death. I'm thinking, how hungry would I have to be to run an antelope to death? You know, you've seen the gazelles, right, in Africa? I mean, we said our early ancestors came from Africa, right? A gazelle's fast. You know, and here comes, a little caveman with his spear. Hey, gazelle. Gazelle's like, you're not getting me. Pew! Takes off. Guess what? Fred Flintstone's still coming. He's still coming. The gazelle stops to catch his breath, right? Because, dang, that dude's still coming. Takes off running again. Here comes Fred Flintstone. He's just keep on running. Because of our mitochondria, because of that aerobic respiration, supplying the energy we need, yeah, he's still coming. Finally, the gazelle's got no energy left. And the gazelle finally says, dude, kill me. I ain't running no more. That's how the human body is designed to operate. Where we stop, more often than not, is not based on our muscle physiology, but it's based on our mental toughness, right? I'm tired. I don't want to do that anymore. That hurts. Instead of working out, I want a Big Mac, right? Who are probably some of the baddest, toughest individuals on the planet? Who are probably some of the baddest, toughest individuals on the planet? You ever seen Navy SEALs operate? They're pretty bad, right? I don't want to mess with a Navy SEAL. I'm sorry, I don't know about you. But Navy SEALs have a philosophy. It's called the 40% philosophy. You know what their 40% philosophy is? When you physically are done, you're doing pull-ups, or if you're doing push-ups, if you're running, when you are physically done, physiologically, you're really only 40% done. Your body can do 60% more. Now, Navy SEALs do. That's why I'm not a Navy SEAL. But that's the reserve that we have. Our brains are designed to protect us from doing stupid stuff and hurting ourselves. But in emergency situations, our bodies can do so much more. Have you heard about the mothers or the fathers that will lift cars off their kids and stuff? Man, that's how much more our bodies can do. But our brains, typically in normal situations, like, that's enough. I'm good. I'm going to stop. I'm tired. But that just goes to show our muscles can do so much using this aerobic respiration. Aerobic means our mitochondria using oxygen, making ATP. Now, also in emergency situations, when, instead of trying to chase the gazelle, we got a saber-toothed tiger trying to catch us, right? And we're not just jogging along. We're running for our lives. We're out of oxygen. Well, our body has this anaerobic metabolism where we can produce energy without oxygen. Here's a trade-off. When we use oxygen, we can make about 38 molecules of ATP per glucose. Without oxygen, guess how many we make per glucose? 2. 2 is still better than none. 2 is still better than being a meal for the saber-toothed tiger, but you're not going to last long once you enter this anaerobic phase. You got maybe 2 or 3 minutes when you're in this anaerobic metabolism. You're working as hard as you can, and after that 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to start to build up lactic acid in your muscles and in your bloodstream, and your muscles are finally going to say, I'm done. That's when athletes say they hit the wall. You're just done. And this is the other great thing that causes your muscles to be really sore. Have we all experienced maybe a day when we did stuff that we really probably shouldn't have done, and we did too much because we thought we could? We used to could do it, but we hadn't worked out in 2 years, and we decided, we could still do it. And you wake up the next day and you can't move. A lot of that is the accumulation of the lactic acid in your muscles. That's one reason why you stretch after you work out. Stretching kind of squeezes that lactic acid into your bloodstream and gets it out of your muscles. In our previous slide, the first 10 seconds we had ATP that was in our muscle. That ATP that already was stored in our muscle before we started working out, that is the oxygen reserve we have. That's why when you first start, for those first 10 seconds, are you breathing hard? When you first start running or working out, do you breathe hard for those first 10 seconds? No, because you're using the ATP that was already there. When you finish working out, do you instantly stop breathing hard? It takes a little bit of time, that cool down time. That's because you're trying to build back up that oxygen reserve in your muscle, and you're trying to replenish now what is the oxygen debt. You used that was in the bank. Now we got to load the bank back up for the next time you have to do something active. That's why you don't start breathing heavy right away, and that's why you still breathe heavily even after the exercise is done to replenish that ATP that needs to exist in your muscles for the next time you have to start doing something very strenuous. Now we're still on skeletal muscle. And I said we would start simple, and you're like, it's gotten pretty complicated. Well, skeletal muscle isn't all the same. We have a lot of different types. We're going to simply look at these 2 types, the slow twitch and the fast twitch. The slow and the fast is really related to how slowly or how quickly those little Q-tip heads of myosin can liberate the energy from ATP. So if you have muscles that have a lot of slow twitch fibers, since they break down that ATP more slowly, they're going to give you a lot of strength, a lot of power, and a lot of endurance. Whereas the fast twitch fibers, they're going to give you a lot of explosive strength, but it's for much shorter duration. This is power and endurance. This is strength and speed. And so when you look at sprinters, world-class sprinters, somebody's got the 100-meter record now. It's not Minute anymore. Who's got the 100 record now? Some were a little short. Minute was so tall. This is a little short guy. I forget what his name is. But he has a lot of fast twitch fibers in his leg muscles versus those marathon runners. And there's always the guys from, who are the ones that always win the Boston Marathon? The ones from Uganda? The little bit short guys are about that big around. They can just run forever. They're the ones that run down the gazelles. They are going to have a lot of the slow twitch fibers in their legs. You can't change that. It's genetic. You're born that way. You can maximize what you have, but you're never going to change your fiber types in your body just through your exercise and working out. All right, so now let's talk about a couple of muscles and what they do. Sorry, question.
How do you know if you have slow twitch or fast twitch?
Well, you can sort of determine that based on if you're doing some sort of athletic event. Yeah, if you're better at the fast running or better at the distance running sort of thing, the only other way would take a biopsy of a certain muscle and find the different fiber types histologically. Right. So let's look at our muscles and what they do. All right? We've done the biceps already and we've done the triceps. So let's look. Pectorals, your pecs. Where are those? Those are your chest muscles. They're attached. The origin is going to be your sternum, and the insertion is going to be your upper arm. And so when you contract your pecs, your arms are going to move inward and toward the midline. So these are moving, you're drawing the arms to the body. This is called, the technical term for this is called an adduction. You're adding your arms to the middle of your body. Now we've got muscles on our shoulders that are going to pull the arms backwards. Again, this antagonistic group. And when you pull your arms away from the midline, that's an abduction. If a child gets abducted, they're taken from their parents. So taken away from the midline, added to the midline is adduction. All right? But for us, draw the arms to the body, to the midline. Biceps, flex or bend the forearm. Quadriceps, the four muscles in our thigh. This is going to bend the thigh and the lower leg. Your hamstrings. Where are your hamstrings? Everybody know where the hamstrings are? If you've ever pulled one of these suckers right here on the back of the thigh, its attachment point is going to cause your knee to bend. It's going to draw your foot upward. All right? So that's the action of the hamstring. Gastrocnemius, this is your calf muscle. This is going to bend your foot. So your gastrocnemius, or the calf muscle, is going to bend your foot. We've got our triceps, straighten the forearm. Your deltoids in your shoulders, these are the ones that make the shoulder rounded. That's going to cause your arm to raise. So if you want to work on your shoulder muscles in the gym, your deltoids have 3 heads, an anterior, a medial, and a posterior. If you do this exercise, it's working the anterior. If you do this exercise straight out, that's doing the medial. You have to kind of get on the cable pulleys and pull backward, and that's going to work the rear deltoids. But those are the actions of those muscles. You don't have to learn all of these. This just gives you the example of our different muscles. There's our pecs. There's our quadriceps. We've got our hamstring group in the middle, and there's our gastrocnemius. But again, the important thing about all of these is their action, which depends on those 2 points, the origin and the insertion.